Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Armor of Truth Live number 340. I had a misfire on our first go-around, so we're back here with you now. Hopefully you guys can see and hear us now. Ben Franklin is still shocked. I'm shocked. We're all shocked. The world seems to be in an uproar. And our topic today is United Nations. It's the Summit of the Future. The 79th United Nations General Assembly is underway in earnest. And it marks a crucial milestone in the global effort to accelerate progress toward, drumroll please. That's not a drumroll, but it's scary because it's all about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. That is the master plan for humanity. This year's theme is leaving no one behind, whether you want to come or not. Leaving no one behind, acting together for the advancement of peace, sustainable development, and human dignity for present and future generations. So this highly anticipated Summit of the Future, well, the General Assembly is going to be going on longer, but September 22nd and 23rd, those 2 days specifically, heads of state and government will gather to address the critical challenges and gaps in global governance that have been exposed by recent global shocks. New terms here. Shocks, global shocks. This is one of the new terms, right? This is, instead of emergency, now it's global shock. The Summit of the Future aims to reaffirm commitments to the SDGs, of course, to talk about updating the United Nations Charter while enhancing cooperation and laying the foundations for a reinvigorated multilateral system. It will result in a negotiated pact for the future. You didn't vote for any of this. You didn't ask for any of this. You don't want any of this. The Pact for the Future is an action-oriented document aimed at bolstering global cooperation and effectively adapting to current challenges, shocks, for the benefit of all, and future generations. I like what James Lindsay said about that phrase, for all. Lindsay says here, what a good chance to remind you that for all, in communist speak, means with a strong prejudice for some over others. That's what equity means. Equity means distributive justice. Equity, by definition, means discrimination. Inequality. So on one hand, they're fighting inequality. On the other hand, they're creating inequality. There is a particular class, the privileged, who must be discriminated against. That's what anti-racism is. The underlying assumption is that some Americans, no doubt here undocumented Americans, if we're talking in the terms of America here, aren't getting a fair shake. And require wealth, goods, services, access, and opportunity redistributed to them utterly unfairly and without having earned it. It's so important that we get a handle on communist manipulations of language and learn to spot and reject the underlying premise. In this case, the underlying premises to be spotted and rejected are. There, that's a little better. Number one, that some Americans are less equal than others, which is in fact false regarding barriers to access and opportunity. That is the feature of free market capitalism. In fact, everyone is equal in opportunity. Number two, that Marxist socialist redistribution, equity, and inclusion schemes can help solve this alleged problem. which they obviously cannot, they never have, and they never will. That's not what it's not about solving the problem. It's about power and control. Obviously, every president of the United States is president for all Americans in the sense of being the chief executive of our constitutional republic. He's responding to Kamala Harris saying that she's going to be the president for all Americans, which is a non-starter. Of course, you're the president for all Americans. So we can tell this particular verbiage must mean something less obvious than what she says on the surface. It's also a lie, of course. The Biden-Harris administration has already systematically and institutionally discriminated against all Americans who don't support their regime, including disenfranchising them, impoverishing them, and instituting two-tier applications of law that favor certain groups, most notably illegal aliens, over others, especially over hardworking, everyday American citizens. These facts reflect the democratic centralism. Here's a term we need to get. Democratic centralism of Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, more than the democratic republicanism of Jefferson, James Madison, Lincoln. Every American citizen who isn't enthralled to Democratic Party power can see these biases, abuses, thefts, and lies with their own eyes and feel in their own lives and livelihoods. Marxists, when not just lying in order to do a power grab, always assume when anyone does any less well than someone else, especially when this happens by groups on average, the data, there must be some structural or systemic inequality that only they understand and correct. You see, Marxism it's a worldview. It's a total life and worldview. And so that means that all of its presuppositions are necessarily true. If communism, fails in one area of the world, as it has every time it's been instituted, it's not communism that failed. It wasn't implemented properly. They do this to hold up those groups and their members as tokens in order to seize power to implement socialism or communism, and then to turn around and attack anyone who complains. We don't have to take this any longer. But change in this starts by understanding what they mean when they use manipulative language of this kind. It's important to reject lies and manipulations. There's a lot of criticism out there today for coming from the left and coming from the truth movement too, for those of us who are sounding the alarm on communism. The criticism is that's not really what it's about. That's old language. It doesn't really apply today. I submit to you that even if we oversimplify Marxism or socialism, which rises up out of Marxism the way it's seen today, and its ultimate realization, a communist utopia, I submit to you that if we oversimplify those terms a bit from time to time, it's a good thing. It's fruitful to do that. Because it is a little more complex than that. But when we can understand the methods that they're using to control masses right now, the hate craft directed toward Donald Trump, for example. If we can understand these things, we can play a part in raising the consciousness of other people out there who are looking on. The criticism is, if you're interacting in the digital space, well, it's all, you're in a digital ghetto, or you have your freedom of speech, but you don't have freedom of reach. There are many things in the world I can't control, and it is a fact that it is better to communicate face-to-face in person with a person or a group of people. But when we have the opportunity to speak to wide groups of people, and we have the opportunity to raise their consciousness, meaning, I don't mean anything new age, I just mean that helping them to see through what's happening around them in their neighborhoods, in their towns, that's a good thing. Because a lot of people don't understand what they're seeing. They don't understand why people are just flat out lying. Why is it that pets, why do two people from the same community, one says, yes, pets are disappearing, being eaten. Another person will say, nope, haven't seen anything like that, it's not happening. Well, the truth is you don't really know unless you're there. But the point is this, there is a process underneath all of that. When you can take an issue that's important and you can discuss it and you can criticize it and you can talk about it and you can inject it into the public square, into the discussion, eventually it loses its importance. Was the election in 2020, was it legitimate? Well, the question's been asked so many times now that both sides are still right where they were all along, because it's lost its meaning. Many people believe it's just come into the conversation believing that it's already corrupt. There's not even any reason talking about it. I submit to you that if we have that frame of mind, we have been influenced by these kinds of tactics. So it is absolutely worth it. And I intend to come back and talk about this in a little more detail later, because I appreciate the critique and I appreciate the opportunity to respond to it, because I am firmly planted in my position that, yeah, it's worth engaging on this topic to talk about communism and sometimes perhaps to oversimplify it so that people can understand what they're seeing. Now, we can get into esoteric issues like what form of capitalism are we actually going to be under and all. That's fine. That's valid. That's worthy. But people right now need to understand what in the world can they actually do to understand what's happening in the world around them. How can they combat it? And the first thing to do is to understand what the heck you're looking at, how to respond to it. We'll come back to this later. I didn't intend on going down that path today, but we'll get to it. Let me just play a little clip here about the Summit of the Future.
The Summit of the Future is designed for the leaders of the world to take a look at the whole global architecture, at how we do international cooperation, and to make it better. The most important ingredient is trust. The summit is going to adopt 3 agreements: a Pact for the Future, a Global Digital Compact, and a Declaration on Future Generations. The Pact for the Future has 5 chapters on sustainable development, peace and security, youth and future generations, science and technology, and transforming global governance. You look at the UN and you think governments are the key players, and that's true, they're the ones sitting around the table, but they do so on behalf of their people. Civil society actors, young people have been involved throughout and will be at the summit. Private sector will be here in recognition of the massive role they have in shaping people's lives and opportunities today. This summit is for and by everyone, and everyone should see themselves reflected in it. The summit is not just 4 days in September. Most of the seeds that we plant at this summit will take some time to grow and flourish, and all of us have to be involved in holding governments responsible for living up to their commitments on the international stage. It's going to take all of us to make this summit a success.
Yeah, that's right. Axiom Descent in the chat says trust. Yeah. The lie they mean. Yeah, that's true. They need you to trust what they say because they're about to serve you up a big steaming heap of lies. Because the documents for this Summit of the Future, this I forgot my terminology. This Pact for the Future, these documents have still not been agreed upon. In fact, they weren't publicly debated. In fact, the way that member states would agree, the process was they make the changes and they submit it to everyone. And if no one dissents or complains, and it passes. It's called something James Roguski describes. It's like a silent process. Yeah, this violates the very charter of the United Nations. They're off on a tangent here, and they're doing what we always knew they were there to do, which is, as she said, to reimagine, to redo global governance. That means to no more sovereignty in their mind. The United Nations General Assembly is the main UN policy-making organ. That's what they call it. They call it an organ, the central organ. Whatever. The Assembly meets regularly from September to December each year, and they'll meet after that as required. What they do is they discuss specific issues on agenda items or sub-items, and then those lead to the adoption of resolutions. And that's what this Summit of the Future is about. Now, we're going to get over here, get back here to this article that Summer wrote yesterday. Let's go ahead and do this now, because I want to get to this clip right here where House Republicans have come out and they are calling for defunding the WHO, withdrawing from the WHO and the United Nations both. I'll just let you hear what they have to say. I'll try to skip around here because it's 20 minutes or so, but I'll try to skip around a little bit.
Well, thank you for being here today for our press conference on what I describe as the most important issue that's getting the least amount of attention relative to its importance in our country. And like many other issues, we're going to be deciding on November 5 what kind of a country we're going to be, and it applies to this issue as well. President Trump had withdrawn the U.S. from the WHO, and of course the Biden administration, like every other disastrous decision they made, reversed those policies when...
It's happened a couple times over the past decade or so where we've withdrawn from this multilateral organization, and then one administration comes back in and see, it takes at least a 1-year process to withdraw from the WHO or the United Nations. One of them might be 2 years, but anyway, it's not, you just don't withdraw immediately. There's a process of a year or 2 years that you're still a member and you still pay dues and all that, but
the Biden-Harris administration got in charge. Well, later this week, the UN is going to hold a, quote, summit for the future. And they're going to produce, this is right from their website, an intergovernmentally negotiated, action-oriented pact for the future with a chapter on transforming global governance. Ascending beyond the powers being sought by its subordinate agency, the WHO, the UN is seeking even broader and more powerful authority, as you will hear a lot about today. The Biden-Harris administration apparently intends to fully support the surrender and compliance of the U.S. to the UN in these endeavors. They are aligned with the international globalists that hate America, that hate the Constitution, that hate our founders, that hate our founding Judeo-Christian principles, and they want America to become like the rest of the world. They don't want us to be subordinate to or governed by our Constitution. No, they want America to be subordinate to and governed by the UN, the World Health Assembly, and the WHO. And in fact, they intend to join with others at the UN summit this week to vote to award additional powers to the UN Secretary General. They seek to facilitate the evolution of the UN from an international cooperative body to an international governing body. These powers would be triggered by any one of a number of so-called global emergencies, whether it was a so-called climate emergency, a health emergency, a cyber emergency, or a gun violence emergency, whatever that's supposed to be, a financial emergency, or whatever they deem appropriate. And the Biden-Harris administration is in full agreement with the UN and the WHO on efforts to place us under their authority and to require such things as their international health regulations, including the surveillance of U.S. citizens, the censoring of dissenting views, and much more. The American people didn't vote for this, and they don't support this, and it's up to the people's representatives, that's us gathered here today, to have a responsibility to expose this and to reject this. The U.S. should defund the WHO again. We should withdraw from the WHO. Any agreements with the WHO or the UN should require Senate approval or disapproval. And a bipartisan House majority voted to require Senate approval just last week with Tom Tiffany's bill on the House floor. So I'm proud to be joined here by my House colleagues and others who are appropriately concerned and educated, informed, and leading on this issue. Again, this is the most important issue that's getting the least amount of attention relative to its importance and its impact on our country and on the American people. And with that, I yield to the gentleman from South Carolina, Ralph Norman.
All right, we're going to skip Ralph Norman. I'm going to jump ahead to the good doctor here. This is a really good segment here. I think you'll appreciate this. And we're going to talk about this because we have talked about this a lot this year, earlier in the year, back in the spring, you know, when everyone went to Geneva when the pandemic treaty, when they were trying to ratify it. And our position was, we don't want the Senate voting on these things, because that could give the World Health Organization, for example, more legitimacy than they already have. And there's no guarantee that if they declare some emergency and then these senators have to vote on whether or not we're going to follow the international health regulations, for example, Are we positive? Are we sure that they're going to vote against it? Are they always going to vote against it? So we think this is a bad idea because these policies already exist. They're already being put forward into regions and local areas through local governments and through healthcare networks. And so they're already there. They're already being done. So the first line of defense is not the Senate or the Congress. The first line of defense is you and me. It's us in making sure that our local governments aren't taken in by this. That these policies, that means we have to be aware of what the IHR, what the international health regulations are. We have to be aware of what the policies of the Pact for the Future are, so that we know whether or not our local governments are engaging in implementing these policies locally. Now, that's a hard one for people to understand because it sounds like it's a good thing if the Senate is going to vote on this, right? Because they can shut it down. They can. That's true. But are you sure they're going to shut it down? Will they always do that? It doesn't cost a senator anything to say, yeah, I'll vote against that, when there's no vote on the floor. But when the vote's on the floor, and it takes time, these things just don't happen overnight. It would be weeks, maybe, at least days, but probably weeks of debating and pushing it through committees and deciding what to do about it. It wouldn't be immediate. And during that period of time, how many of these congressmen and senators do you think are being funded in some way by the very pharmaceutical industry that's actually creating these World Health Organization policies? That's the thing that I don't think people are understanding, that James Roguski has done a very good job of pointing out, It's that it's not just about shutting down the WHO or blocking the WHO out from our nation. You have to stop the pharmaceutical industry or the healthcare industry inside our nation. They're the ones working with them. These policies come from somewhere because they benefit someone. So who do they benefit? Well, they definitely benefit the healthcare industry and pharmaceutical industry. So it's up to us. But anyway, there's a lot of good things in this video, and I want to play this piece right here from the good doctor. I'll let him introduce here.
But they cannot force Americans to follow laws and regulations not passed by our own federal government. Thank you, and with that, I cede to Ronnie Jackson.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to start by saying, as a physician who's followed the WHO for many years now, in my time in government, during 3 presidential administrations, and now as my time as a member of Congress, I can tell you that the WHO in particular and the UN in general do not represent what's best for this country. In fact, they do everything they can to undermine us and defeat us. Look at what happened during COVID as a perfect example. During COVID, they lied to us and they worked with China to cover up the origins of COVID. You have to ask yourself, do you really want, next time this happens, for the WHO to decide how taxpayer dollars in this country are spent, to decide what resources we are and are not eligible for, despite the fact that we overwhelmingly fund their operations? That's what you're going to get. And as my colleague, Mr. Good pointed out, they can define an emergency in any way they want. And believe me, it will be creative, and it won't be a healthcare crisis again next time. It'll be something related to the climate or gun control or some other woke agenda that they have on their radar. This IHR treaty is nothing more than a redistribution of wealth and government control via global governance. This fits right into the communist and socialist ideology that defines today's Democrat Party in this country. Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and their administration would like nothing more than to pass their responsibility to protect this country's health and livelihood to another country, many of which do not appreciate the United States, do not like the United States, and many of which are hostile to the United States. They would love nothing more than to pass this responsibility to these countries. I am a firm believer that from this point forward, we should never give another penny to the World Health Organization. They have not represented us well. They never have, and they never will. They are not an ally to this country. They are not an asset to this country. We should not be paying hard-earned taxpayer dollars for their efforts that are oftentimes against us. With regards to the United Nations, I've said it before, I'll say it again.
True.
I think the best thing we could do for the United Nations is to go to New York and push the entire thing off into the East River.
Yeah.
And with that, I turn it over to Tony Perkins from the Family Research Council. Thank you.
Okay, well, push that thing into the East River. That's probably the best idea I've heard ever as far as what to do at the United Nations. So there you have it. By the way, let me mention too, we always want to talk about solutions. What can you do, right? What? It's one thing to come on here and talk about how bad everything is. It's one thing to come on here and talk about freedom of speech and how they're attacking capitalism, or they're transforming it into surveillance capitalism, and these things are important. It's important to understand those things, but there's really nothing more important than knowing what to do about it. What are you going to do? I mean, what are you actually going to get up and walk out of your house and do in your community as an American, or as Paul Craven's with us in the chat? What are you going to do in your nation? Paul Craven comes to us from across the pond, Scotland. Thanks for being with us today. Well, yesterday, Summer and I went down to our, we had every third Tuesday is a city council meeting in our town. And we went down there to do some reconnaissance to find out who's on our city council. And specifically who is your town manager. That's even more important than your mayor. Your town manager is the person. If somebody's going to be influencing part of your local government, it's going to be that one, because that's the one, especially United Nations Agenda 21, Sustainable Development 2030, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same thing. But the NGOs, the regional super governments, these shadowy groups that do the bidding of the United Nations, they're already here doing it. It's going to be your town manager that they're going to influence with money, power, stroking egos, whatever. And so we went there yesterday, and our main concern yesterday was the migrant, the illegal alien issue, the illegal migrant issue, because it seems like what happened in Ohio was, it's happened in many other places around the nation. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, because Nick Johnson has done an excellent video where he went to Springfield, Ohio, and talked to the people there. He went to the Haitian, whatever it's called, the center there where they go to find their jobs. It's a organization center there. Interesting how they treated him. No one would talk to him. No Haitian would talk to him. They've been told not to talk to anyone. So these small towns like Springfield, Ohio, have been overwhelmed. 50,000 people, thereabouts, is their population. And suddenly 20,000 Haitians are there. Well, over the period of a couple years, 20,000 built up. First it was 500, then it was 5,000, and it just ballooned from there. And it's a strain on the resources. It's dangerous. Showed one guy who was driving I don't know what it was a $100,000 Lexus or Lincoln or something with an L, I think. But how does this migrant have a $100,000 vehicle? This quickly. Something's not right. And it looks like that what's happening in these areas, these companies get stipends perhaps if they'll hire these people. I don't know. It's not clear exactly why they're all congregating in that particular place. There must be some kind of industry there because they're working, is what's strange. They're getting stipends, and one lady said she works at a grocery store, so she could see the tab on their EFT cards, and there were I think she said one had a $15,000 balance on it, one had a $29,000 balance left on it. Something's going on. There's something strange happening. It's happening in the UK also. It's been happening in Europe way before it started happening here. But anyway, at our city council meeting last night, Summer got up and basically just alerted everyone, just to get it on the record. We're concerned about this, and we want to know if you're thinking about it, if you're aware of it, first of all, and if you're aware of it, do you have any kind of plans to deal with it if it happens in our town? And so that was a fruitful conversation, and it was, in Summer's words, it was comforting to hear that they're aware of it, and that at least our city council's not really interested in having that happen here. So next month we'll go to the next town over, to that city council, and do the same thing. So this is something that you can do also, right? Because we've seen all these videos on Twitter or X and YouTube or wherever else of city council meetings where people are they're flabbergasted. They're exasperated. They're overwhelmed. We saw a clip of a city council meeting in Alabama where even at the mention of migrants and strain on the local resources, the parliamentarian or whoever was running the meeting there, it was small. It was about like the size of our town. She just shut it down. Accused the people of, of racism, being bigots, and just shut the meeting down. Not going to listen to this type of rhetoric. And all we could see happening was there was a man at a podium during the public comment period asking questions. These, again, are Marxist tactics. This is how it's done. You get the illusion that you can complain. The Delphi technique, for example, is you get 3 minutes to complain, but what happens with that complaint after it's all over with? So this is something that you can do. And we also want to show you, if you find out you're showing up at your city council meeting or at some kind of hearing, public hearing in your hometown, and you realize that the Delphi technique is happening. That means people are getting 2 or 3 minutes to come up and speak their piece, or 1 minute or whatever. But it seems like the thing's already been decided. You just get to come and air your grievance, but it's not going to change anything. This is what Mao did in China during the Cultural Revolution. Would allow people to come in and air their grievances. And then they took everyone's name. And those people got sent off to the countryside, to the labor camps. So that's something that we promised you that we would do, that I think now might be a good time to put that together. Just how to frustrate a hearing whenever they're running a Delphi technique on you. And really the way to do it is raise the consciousness of everyone around. Let them know, help them to understand what's going on. Like, for instance, you'll show up at one of these meetings with, now I'm not talking about your regular city council meeting. You don't want to go and shut that down. You want to play along with that one. I'm talking about when there might be a public hearing on a particular policy, or they're going to put this new smart growth mixed use facility here and you've recognized this is a bad idea, or they want to limit the citizens' access to a pond or a creek that people fish in, or people just for any reason. They want to keep people out of the woods, out of the forest for some reason. And you think that's wrong, and they hold a public hearing about it. So if you and maybe 2 or 3 friends show up at one of these Delphi meetings, but you don't let anybody know that you came together, and you each have, and you're each committed to asking questions from different parts. You don't sit together, asking questions from different parts of the room, challenging what's happening. That's how you can get a groundswell. That's how you can get an actual grassroots effort started. One person won't have much of an effect. But when it appears that there's a group of people with the same idea, people pay more attention to that. They think, well, maybe something's really going on wrong here. And then if the meeting gets shut down or after it's over, these people are going to want to hear from you. They're going to come talk to you. Some might be mad at you. I'm sure some definitely will be mad at you, because some of them will have a stake in what's going on there. Well, that's one of the strategies. We'll come back to you later and explain what kind of questions you can ask. How can you challenge that kind of a meeting? But we encourage you to get involved in your local government. You don't have to run for office. You don't have to commit more time than once a month. Go to your city council meeting and listen. Get up and speak at the public comment time. Tell them what you're seeing on TV. Tell them your concerns, because that's what they're there for. They're not there just to do what the United Nations is doing and pass all of these policies without your input. That's not what they're there for. But that's what they're being told they're there for, because they believe, and they're being told by NGOs, regional supergovernments. A regional supergovernment is like a collection of mayors and city councilmen and town planners who come together from many different cities, and they decide on things they're going to do, policies they're going to implement, right? Because you can't you can't elect or vote against the mayor in the next town. So this is how they do it. And so you want to expose these things, raise the consciousness of the people around you, raise the awareness of the people around you with things like this. And so our article that Summer put out here is this. There's some of the future, shaping our common future. You can see that. We've talked about our common future before. We'll talk more about this in just a minute. Reality check. We must utilize the correct strategy in order to exit the United Nations and the WHO properly. Otherwise, we might walk right into a planned trap. As we have covered for you previously in some of these other articles on regionalism, the alt media has failed you. Back when the WHO won a major battle earlier this year, passing the international health regulations, the amended international health regulations, everyone in the alt media was celebrating because, hey, the pandemic treaty failed. Yeah, well, they didn't ratify it yet. It hasn't failed. The alt media failed you. Lost in clickbait land. Also, this article on Substack, Hidden Tyranny, the WHO is not the greatest threat to American sovereignty. Listen to this quote by James Madison. If tyranny and oppression come to this land, it will be in the guise of fighting a foreign enemy. So who is the number one greatest threat, the most immediate threat to American sovereignty? It's not the United Nations, and it's not NGOs. It's not the federal government, and it's not your state government. The greatest threat to American sovereignty is Americans, specifically idle Americans who just refuse to believe what they're hearing or to engage it. Bill H.R. 1425, which is what these senators were talking about here earlier, this bill was to require Senate ratification of the WHO pandemic treaty. But the international health regulations were already amended and ratified. So since we are a member of the World Health Organization, that means whenever they declare an emergency and they start sending out edicts and orders to follow these international health regulations, who is it that's going to enforce that? The United Nations, the World Health Organization, can say whatever they want. They can make whatever policy they want. But without some force behind it, it doesn't mean anything. Well, the answer to that question is, who's going to enforce international health regulations? Who's going to enforce Pact for the future? It's going to be your neighbors. It's going to be your city council people, perhaps. It might be people in your own family. This is why it's very important to raise the awareness of people around you about what's happening and about how it's not in their best interest just to go along with these things. So while we're very pleased to hear these high representatives, officials in the federal government, people who represent the people, finally speaking out this way and saying things like, we need to get out of the WHO and the UN, we need to defund them and then withdraw from them, that's excellent. That's good to hear. But we don't need the Senate voting on anything that comes down from the World Health Organization or the United Nations. Vigorous and sustained outrage over this Machiavellian scheme has come from a significantly astute movement of WHO critics and sovereignty watchmen. However, there is some confusion about what would happen if the so-called pandemic treaty, or the Pact for the Future for that matter, were ratified by the World Health Assembly in the case of the pandemic treaty. would be the General Assembly for on the Pact for the Future. You've probably heard many people, podcasters, bloggers, health experts maybe. You might have heard Meryl Nass, for example, present one or more conflicting assessments of the threat and various suggested responses. Some say the pandemic treaty directly threatens United States sovereignty. Others say that for the pandemic treaty to have any legal force, it must first be voted on by the United States Senate. Now, back in May 2024, and thank you very much to Summer for putting this article out this is a good time to put this article out since they came out recently or yesterday with that press conference. And because we did a lot of work in researching and studying for these articles just to find out what actually happens when they declare an emergency. And what we've come to find out is, well, it doesn't matter if they declare an emergency. Somebody has to enforce it. Ultimately, it's going to come down to your local police department, maybe. But it's going to be your neighbors. Maybe even your own family members. That's where sovereignty is protected. If we have to rely on the Senate to protect it for us, we've already lost. And it's good that they're doing this, don't get me wrong. But we already need to be involved and engaged in this. Back in May of this year, we wrote, this is an article by Summer. She writes, have you read this letter that 49 senators sent to Joe Biden? They asked President Biden to shift his attention to reform the World Health Organization. This is a problem. Reforming the WHO is not a viable solution because the organization is fundamentally corrupt and has vacated its stated mission. At best, reforming the WHO accomplishes nothing. At worst, and more likely, it would make a bad situation even worse, perhaps with a higher funded WHO that has even more authority. You don't want to bring anything from the WHO onto the floor for vote, because these congressmen and senators, you don't know exactly how they're going to go with. They might vote for it, and then you've got a bigger problem on your hands. If the goal is to protect the sovereignty of the United States, H.R. 1425 could very likely have the opposite effect by opening the door to the potential dilution of our sovereignty. Rather than clarifying our sovereignty, if passed, the bill would confuse and fundamentally alter the nature of both the pandemic agreement and the U.S. relationship with the World Health Organization, effectively undermining U.S. sovereignty by removing the intended flexibility and voluntary nature of our membership with the WHO or the United Nations. And so then in this article, Summer has included here for you from from the Hidden Tyranny article, Bill H.R. 1425, it does more harm than good. And so we'll invite you to go check this out. Also, 2 articles, Hidden Tyranny, the WHO is not the greatest threat to American sovereignty. Maybe we'll put the links to these articles in the description of this video. Otherwise, you can go Armor of Truth mobile app to the articles or the blog tab. Will take you right to this. Or go to substack.com, search for Armor of Truth, and you can find these articles there. The other article, Alt Media Has Failed You. And this is probably one of the most important articles. This one, Summer and myself combined on this one. Regionalism. The threat is not to national sovereignty, but to local autonomy. Let me repeat that. The threat we're facing is not the first, most important threat, the most immediate threat. I don't mean most important, I mean most immediate threat to sovereignty is our local autonomy. Being able to have, for our local governments to remain autonomous. That is sovereignty. That's where sovereignty, that's the foundation. That's where the rubber meets the road with sovereignty. For example, let's say you've got an administration in the White House who decides to break down the sovereignty of the United States by opening the borders wide, not prosecuting any illegal aliens. Or maybe just catch them when they come in, give them a lot of money and a phone, some clothes and some food, bus ticket or a plane ticket anywhere they want to go in the United States, and let them go. Well, that would be one thing. But if the people in the towns where these buses or planes show up with these people are already organized, you have a constitutional sheriff there in your county, and you're aware and the people around you are aware and know what's happening, you can stop this before it ever happens in your local area, because sovereignty starts with local autonomy. You can't, the way this nation and the way our liberty is set up, if we're just sitting back and expecting the federal government or even the state government to take care of protecting us, then you're not free. You don't really have liberty. What is freedom? Freedom is exerting the rights that you know you have and being willing to accept the consequences, no matter what the consequences are. So these articles, we encourage you to check these articles out, and we'll include the links for you. We'll put them up on our, perhaps on our Twitter or Instagram. Okay. Back to the article here that Summer put out, because this piece, now this is really interesting because we want to be out of the United Nations. And we played this clip for you the other day. Summer found this one. I think James Roguski put it up. The other spin on this whole situation is that the Pact for the Future is also rumored to discuss Article 6 of the UN Charter on the most ironic grounds of human rights violations. Lurking in the background of these negotiations, there's a Marxist-led international movement seeking to forcibly expel the United States from the United Nations.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let's talk about something that really should have been talked about and pursued a long time ago, but nobody ever talked about it. No one ever suggested it because no one ever thought it was possible. Just even suggesting it was impossible. But when you say the unsayable, well, then it's no longer unsayable. It isn't unsayable anymore. And you've changed the narrative forever. And you bring into possibility what was never imagined to be possible. And what I'm talking about, of course.
I just have to stop there because you understand what he's talking about there. He's talking about not necessarily raising consciousness, but creating a consciousness. This is how Marxism creates, cultural Marxism creates class consciousness, right? It's, you say the unsayable. That is the process of dialectic. Anyway, let me not get bogged down.
Of course, is something that I tweeted about the other day, and that is expelling the United States of America from the United Nations.
So you understand here, this guy is talking about the United Nations is the big evil empire, and they must be expelled from the United Nations for human rights violations. Interesting, huh? Interesting development.
You know, once you say it, everyone can understand why this is logical. Everyone can understand why this is justified, and everyone can understand why this is necessary. Everyone knows that the United States completely rigged the United Nations system right from the beginning. Everyone knows that with their unchallengeable veto power, they essentially render the United Nations subservient, toothless, impotent, powerless, and they relegate every single member state as second and third class nation status. It isn't a system for enforcing international law. It's a system for enforcing America's exceptionalism.
Okay, so we can respond to a little bit of that right here, because the problem is not America. It's not the United States. The problem is factions. Some of what he's saying I might agree with, because there are factions in every nation who are bad, do bad things, who have bad ideas, who want to be dictators. And we've got them right here. We've got them in the executive branch right now. So the criticism of America which falls on Americans, is unjustified. Neither you nor myself have been a party to the kind of global military intrigue, global war on terrorism. These are things that we've been victimized by also. The USA Patriot Act, for example, and many others. We also have an article on our Substack about the 9 liberties lost since 9/11, from Bush to Biden. Check that one out. So anyway, we wanted to share that with you. Go to this. We got a new Substack article here. You can find this video. It's pretty interesting to listen to. U.S. House Republicans want to remove us from the UN and the WHO. So this is good news, but we want to make sure that people understand what's actually at stake. And here is the only solution. Get involved locally. Know your town manager. Know your council members. Know who your mayor is. And it's very important to know your sheriff. Find out what their positions are on these issues. Find out what they think about the United Nations. Ask them what they think about policies created at the United Nations or the World Health Organization being implemented locally around you by non-governmental organizations or regional supergovernments. Find out. If they don't know what you're talking about, then at least you've made them aware. Because if we don't do this, we don't deserve liberty. No matter what, the best thing we can do for our nation is to exit these corrupt world domination outlets. And we need to expel the ESGs and the Sustainable Development Goals because they're communist systems. U.S. House Republicans must get the U.S. out of the United Nations and out of the World Health Organization, period. The only vote I'm interested in seeing the Senate or the Congress actually do is that one, to defund the UN, the WHO, and then withdraw us from it. Withdraw us first. If America falls, Summer writes, if America falls, then the world falls. That's just the truth. You can go right now to exitthewho.com. James Roguski has set this up, and you will find everything you need there. He's made it very easy to cut and paste and contact your congressman, because the bill we want is H.R. 79. That was this article right here. H.R. 79 is what we want now. It's the only solution to exit the WHO and exit the United Nations. And so if you go there to exitthewho.com, you will find all the information you need. It couldn't be easier to do. In fact, I will actually I also have this article here, Hidden Tyranny, goes into great detail. This thing is done in 5 parts, I believe. And it explains why we don't want the Senate voting on these things. It gives a history, a chronological recount of events leading up to now. Let's see. We criticize Meryl Nass because she was out during the winter and the spring and early this summer, as many people were. She's not alone. Really pushing H.R. 1425 when what we need is H.R. 79. H.R. 79 is the one that gets us out of the WHO altogether. We do believe that in some sense, the sovereignty argument is a red herring. We've tried to explain that to you here again today. If you think that it's the Congress, if you think it's the Congress's job to protect your liberties, to protect your rights and freedoms, well, you're not going to have them for very long. The government is there to secure your rights. It is your duty to assert those rights, willing to accept the consequences, because that's liberty. Anyway, let's see here. This is a long article. I think this thing might have been 7,000 words or something. There's H.R. 79, the bill to exit and defund the WHO. We've got that one broken down for you. And it also goes on, in part 2, talks about the truth about the United Nations and the World Health Organization. This is the hidden tyranny part, right? This is how was the WHO started? How was the United Nations started? Where did it come from? So we give you the background on that. What is the plan for the New World Order? That's in here. As you can tell, this is a long piece. Sustainable financing. This is one of Summer's big finds over the past year and a half, or maybe 2 years, where she discovered this sustainable financing. This video on YouTube where these World Health Organization officials were discussing how they could promise at least a 35-to-1 return on investment in the World Health Organization, because after all, that's what the pandemic treaty is, right? It's a venture capital scheme. Unhealthy WHOs. This talks about, there's Brock Chisholm, first Director General of the World Health Organization. He said, to achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogmas. Wow, I think it might be. Yeah. Let's, did you hear what he said about individualism? If I can find this article quickly. Yep, look at this. Look at this headline from Los Angeles Times. Let's see. Hopefully, I can get this to show up there. There it is. Look at this headline from the L.A. Times last week. Been meaning to cover this article. To fix climate anxiety. To fix climate anxiety and also climate change, we first have to fix individualism. Marxism. There it is. Interesting, isn't it? Brock Chisholm, first Director General of the World Health Organization. LA Times article last week. Individualism is the problem. What do you do about that? You boldly assert your rights. Protect your freedoms. Protect your liberty. Because it's your job to do it. We don't farm that out to other people. We don't even farm that out to the military. Because inside this nation, it is up to every man of the house, every man of age, to be the defenders of liberty. That means you might need to have you don't have to load a weapon yet. But that's what the Second Amendment is there for. To keep tyrants at bay. As the only global health agency including mental health outcomes in its mandate, the World Health Organization's Comprehensive Mental Health Action Plan, 2013 to 2030, mental health treatment guidelines, and the Secretariat's technical assistance to member states to support The inclusion of mental health services into national strategic planning will be instrumental in closing these treatment gaps. That's a great idea, right? Let's have this globalist, multilateral organization set in mental health policy. That's a great idea. Julian Huxley, first Director General of UNESCO. This has more to do with education. He says the scientific world humanism, world government will be necessary for the next stage in the human evolutionary process. We need a restatement of morality. They go on to say we have to train out of these kids this idea of family. We have to train out of these kids what their parents have put in their heads. The succession of directors general at the World Health Organization has been a cavalcade of mostly Malthusian activists whose worldviews seem to be drawn directly from chiseled epithets on the Georgia Guidestones, openly promoting world courts, population reduction through abortion, through drugs, through food control, through keeping human beings off the land and out of nature because human beings are cancer on the earth. Which reminds me of a clip. Alex Epstein. If you're not familiar with Alex Epstein, let's see here. Applause. You can go to his website. If you just search for Fossil Future, his book is called Fossil Future. I can't remember the name of his website right now. But his website has every green agenda claim refuted. So it's somewhere here. Goodness. There it is, finally. Yeah. Listen to this. I think you'll appreciate this argument.
This is why people think climate change, so to speak, is a crisis. They're evaluating it by human impact as evil, and more impact means worse. So they want a world where we're more endangered from climate, but the climate is more natural. And the question is, are you evaluating good and bad outcomes by the standard of, does it make the world a place where people can have longer, healthier, more opportunity-filled lives? Or is your perspective a better Earth is an Earth that has less human impact? Because if you look at the facts, I've documented this and nobody has refuted this. Many have tried, but the rate of disaster death from climate, so storms and floods and heat, etc., that's declined by 98% over the last century as fossil fuel use and CO2 emissions have increased. And the reason is that our ability to deal with any kind of climate danger, which fossil fuels make possible, but has far outpaced any increase in climate challenges. People think we're in a climate crisis, including people who know that we're safer than ever.
97.
This is why people think...
Come back here now. Right there. 97% of scientists agree with whoever is funding them. And that explains quite a lot. Jacob Nordengard. Summer also included some links to his articles. And I'm going to share a little bit from this article here. Jacob Nordengard has been reporting on the United Nations for many years now. And he does an excellent job. He reports here, this is about the Summit for the Future. He says the Global Challenges Foundation, right there, together with the Stimson Institute, has played a prominent role in preparing for the historic United Nations meeting, Summit of the Future, coming up next week. Early next week, I guess. The summit is expected to produce the outcome document called Pact for the Future. All right. So we know this already, right? What kind of people are behind it? Where does it come from? That's what his article is about. Well, behind the benevolent sounding motives hides scientific racism, Malthusian elitism, and dangerous techno-utopian ideas about safeguarding the future with high-tech surveillance. When you look closely at the players behind these United Nations policy initiatives, you quickly find elite bankers, investors, The same Club of Rome players who brought us the infamous Limits to Growth paper, which kickstarted Agenda 21, Earth Day on April 22nd, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov's birthday, Lenin's birthday, Earth Day, how about that? And Dennis Meadows with his wild predictions that the Earth system would collapse in 12 years. He said that in 1968, and humanity would die out and cease to exist. Jacob writes, Global Challenges Foundation was founded in 2013 by Swedish-Hungarian billionaire and former financier for Shell Oil Sweden, Laszlo, this is a tough name, Zambatvoldi. I'm going to call him Laszlo, who was a staunch advocate for a world government to solve humanity's problems. His philosophy mirrored that of the Club of Rome. For example, the population explosion problem, the rising standards of living are a dire threat to the planet and the cause of catastrophic climate change. Laszlo was also a major donor to the Overpopulation Project, whose motto is too many people consuming too much. One of their prescribed solutions was creating a new global treaty to end population growth. Right. A global treaty to end population growth. Now that's dark. According to Laszlo, the world was in need of a political global organization with understanding and power and authority to tackle these problems. And he also added that it was important that the new system does not require that all nations be democratic in the Western sense of the word. Some of his friends from the investment community were recruited as board of directors, including Christer Jacobson, Bjorn Franzen, and Rockefeller Foundation's senior advisor, Mats Andersson, president at the Fourth Swedish National Pension Fund, as well as the director of Stockholm Resilience Center, Johan Rockström, and the former European Union Commissioner, Margot Wallström, who is a social democrat who later, that's a kind word for communist, who later became Swedish foreign minister. Johan Rockström, who is an agronomist, who had been handpicked by the International Panel on Climate Change's by the IPCC's former chairman, to lead the Stockholm Environment Institute in 2003, would guide this foundation with his framework of planetary boundaries and predictions of tipping points that could trigger dire cascading effects. Now, this term, planetary boundaries, comes up in a book that Summer found for us recently, Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity. This is one of the this would be one of the groups, one of the think tanks, one of the organizations who come up with models for the way things should be. Planetary boundaries and predictions. So this just means that there are certain acceptable levels of activity. For example, there are acceptable levels of human activity. Right? Human impact is what they want to stop to protect the planet. They're not really interested in mitigating the impacts of climate on people. They want to mitigate the impacts of human beings on the climate. In that sense, it is fundamentally anti-human. In 2011, Johan authored the book Bankrupting Nature, Denying Our Planetary Boundaries, with Anders Wickman. And it was published as a report to the Club of Rome in 2012. Anders Wickman is from the Club of Rome, as is one of the authors of this book, Sandrine Dixon DeClave, who we played a clip from her. She's a co-president of the Club of Rome. We played a clip from her several shows back. But this is where, when everybody talks about the science, about climate change, Ultimately, it's issued through the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. But it's this organization that provides the data. Former Social Democrat politician and television anchor Jens Orbach was appointed executive director. Global Challenges Foundation also started a collaboration with Stockholm School of Economics to educate students about urgent and large-scale problems of modern times. In February 2015, they issued their first global catastrophic risks report built on Laszlo's ideas and Future of Humanity's and Future of Humanity, which was one of Laszlo's books, writings. The groundbreaking work on global catastrophic risks. Their director, Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom, a name you might know if you've watched this channel much. Bostrom introduced the concept of existential risks in 2002. Future of Humanity was a futurist research institute founded in 2005 by Bostrom, who was inspired by philosophies deriving from something called the Extropy Institute in California, which was about, the Extropy Institute is about directing human evolution, eradicating diseases, and bringing about a future utopia with eternal lifespans using technology. One of their more outlandish ideas was to upload minds into supercomputers and bring about a post-human existence. Yes, we're still talking about the Summit for the Future at the United Nations. A couple of definitions. Post-human. It's not exactly the same thing as transhuman. Post-human is a concept from science fiction, futurology, contemporary art, and philosophy that describes a person or an entity that exists in a condition or state beyond being human. So it's not necessarily transhumanism, and it shouldn't be confused with transhumanism. Transhumanism is the enhancement of human beings with technology or biotechnology. Extropy, this organization that Nick Bostrom started, extropy, the term means the extent of a living or organizational system's intelligence, functional order, vitality, and capacity, and drive for improvement. All right. Philosophies of life rooted in centuries-old traditions, this was from the Extropy webpage, contain much wisdom concerning personal, organizational, and social living. But how could ancient wisdom, something like the Bible, how could it not be mistaken when it arose in a pre-scientific time? He says, ancient philosophies of life have little or nothing to say about fundamental issues confronting us as advanced technologies begin to enable us to change our identity as individuals and as humans. Again, this is part of the worldview behind the United Nations and this Summit for the Future. Nick Bostrom is also a major promoter of something called simulation theory, which we did a video here on simulation theory. It's one of those videos that got taken down, and I still don't know why that video was taken down. Simulation theory, it wasn't about anything else. Well, here's the idea of simulation theory. They say a technologically mature post-human civilization would almost surely have enormous computing power that would be sufficient to simulate anything, including life. So a sufficiently advanced civilization could even simulate their ancestors. Now, based on a very flawed philosophy of mind, simulation theorists believe that we almost certainly live in a simulation. Now, there's another term, comes from the Greek, it's called solipsism. Solipsism is an extreme form of skepticism about the external world. Solipsism is at the heart of the Mandela effect, for one thing. It's the idea that only one mind exists, mine, and that you and all the other material things in the world are just figments of my imagination. It brings us to a term called hyperreal. Hyperreality is the inability of consciousness to distinguish reality from a simulation of reality, especially in technologically advanced societies. And then the simulacrum is something that replaces reality with its representation. Ultimately, the arguments these people make for some form of simulation theory are really just arguments for basic theism. They're doing what it says in Romans 1, 18, 19, 20. They're doing everything they can to suppress the truth and unrighteousness about the existence and nature of God. These theories typically come from one of two sources: philosophical reasoning or scientific observations. Reasoning, making observations, and doing science is impossible in a universe without the God who has revealed himself in Scripture. Philosophically, arguments about reality being a simulation appeal to futurists and techno-optimists. But what they're doing with simulation theory, they're imagining some future circumstance where technology has advanced to the point where real minds are indistinguishable from simulated minds. So there's the problem with the philosophy of mind. Their assumption is that the mind is located in the matter. That's not anything that's ever been proven. That's not something that science can even deal with. The simulation argument asserts that if technology could ever simulate reality, then we are almost certainly living in a simulation right now. If we're not, such technology is most likely impossible. And since they believe that this technology is possible, they believe we are certainly living in a simulation. This assumes that a civilization capable of making simulations would probably will make them. And a lot of assumptions. And the number of such simulations will probably become extremely large, and this in turn would create a scenario where simulated minds far outnumber real minds, meaning that any given mind, including our own, is statistically more likely to be part of a simulation than actual. As it turns out, the Bible indicates that our earthly lives are only part of a larger whole. The Bible answers this question. There is a real reality above and beyond our material existence. The Bible says our reality is created and designed. But most who support simulation theory reject the idea of God and afterlife or other spiritual concepts. So what you see in simulation theory, what you see in the worldview behind the United Nations Summit of the Future is a Romans 1 effort to suppress the truth about God in unrighteousness, to work as hard as you can to come up with some alternate theory to describe why we're here. That's simulation theory. It's trying so hard to get away from God. It's like the Babylonites. The goal of Extropy, Nick Bostrom's original group, was to use current scientific understanding to define a small set of principles or values that could potentially liberate and existentially enrich humanity. So, the principles are intended to be enduring, underlying ideals. Now, Bostrom also founded, let me get Nick Bostrom up here. There's Nick Bostrom for you. Nick Bostrom also founded the World Transhumanist Association in 1988 and renamed it Humanity Plus. There's the website. We've talked about this group quite a bit on this channel in previous year, like back in 2021. We talked about this a lot, early in 2022. This has become one of the most prominent transhuman philosophers, Nick Bostrom, and he has influenced policymaking at the United Nations. Now, what is transhumanism? It's a loosely defined movement that has developed gradually over the past 20 or so years. Now, when we covered this, I was trying to figure out why would someone imagine creating a circumstance where they could live forever here in this material realm? Well, it's because of something called thanatophobia. That's the fear of death combined with the rejection or outright hostility toward God and a desire for power or the deep desire to be in control of your circumstances, that can consume someone to the point of seeking transhumanism. Transhumanism is a way of thinking about the future that is based on the premise that the human species in its current form does not represent the end of our development, but rather a comparatively early phase. So the big point here that you need to take from this is part of the worldview behind the United Nations and behind this Summit of the Future, Pact for the Future, is this idea of transcending humanity, blending it all together. And this is also a major element of the worldview of Marxism, communism. We have actually a video. Yeah, here's a little clip I'll play for you. Max Moore, also a transhumanist, wrote the letter to Mother Nature, complaining about the circumstances. I'll play this for you because this is part of the mindset behind those that set policy at the United Nations.
Mother Nature, truly, we are grateful for what you have made.
Hang on a minute, something's wrong with that audio. Let me check. Okay.
Eight of us. No doubt you did the best you could.
Strange. I don't know if you can even hear that.
Good. However, with all due respect, we must say that you have, in many ways, done a poor job.
I don't know what's wrong with the audio there, but anyway, you get Max Moore's idea. He complains to Mother Nature that we don't live long enough, that we die. Thanatophobia. Matthew Ehret from Strategic Culture wrote about this. He said, let's get this back over here. Poisonous ideas which characterize today's unipolar paradigm, which masquerades behind a billionaire-authored Great Reset of world civilization. In this reset, we are told by the likes of Klaus Schwab that a fourth industrial revolution will usher in not only a vast automation and artificial intelligence operations at every level of society, but also a merging of humanity with machines. That is a very important element of the fourth industrial revolution. Figures like Elon Musk, Ray Kurzweil, Google's Ray Kurzweil, assert this merging is needed in order to stay relevant in the next phase of our evolution. Davos man himself, Yuval Noah Harari, or as we like to say here, Yuval Harari, echoed that the levers of evolution will now be moved from the randomness of nature into the new gods running Google, Facebook, and the World Economic Forum. Now, let's get back to Bostrom here, because we're not done with Nick Bostrom. Listen to what, oops, wrong article. Listen to what else Nick Bostrom was, goodness, I'm in the wrong place. There it is. There's Bostrom. In 2005, Nick Bostrom formulated the singleton hypothesis. Again, these are the minds and the worldview informing the United Nations in their effort to become this global behemoth. Bostrom formulated the singleton hypothesis, which means a world order in which there is a single decision-making agency at the highest level. Now, this could be artificial intelligence, or it could be the United Nations, or it could be the United Nations with an artificial intelligence running it. Whatever. Including prevention of any threats. So this being, this entity, this decision-making agency would be responsible for preventing any threats, internal or external, to its own existence and supremacy, first of all, and it would have the ability to exert effective control over major features of its domain, including taxation, territorial allocation. People can't go into this area. You can't go into the national park. You can't go into the forest. You can't go onto the lake. These ideas were obviously music to the ears of the rich and powerful. Global Challenges Foundation, again, one of the main think tanks, one of the main groups behind the Summit for the Future, coming up at this 79th UN General Assembly. Global Challenges Foundation embraced this and later hired transhumanist Valdemar Ingdahl, member of Humanity Plus, the transhumanist organization, as their communication officer. Nick Bostrom is viewed as the founding father also of something called long-termism, which is an ethical view that promotes the safeguarding of future generations by averting existential risks. So you can see where the climate change argument's coming from the Club of Rome, blending with techno-utopians and their techno-utopian ideology, with a resemblance to Isaac Asimov's fictitious psychohistory that has come to permeate both Global Challenges Foundation and the United Nations Futures Agenda, as expressed in our common agenda. In Bostrom's view, this could justify to quote, establish some kind of surveillance and enforcement mechanism that would make it possible to interdict attempts to carry out a destructive act. Now, remember earlier when I was saying, so what if the WHO declares an emergency? So what if the United Nations declares an emergency? Who's going to enforce it? Well, ultimately, it would be you and me, or it would be our neighbors, or maybe our family members. So we have to not do that. But it could also be that singleton. It could be that global agency, or it could be that artificial intelligence. No wonder Bostrom was invited to the 2019 Bilderberg meeting, together with Johan Rockström, who we discussed earlier, to discuss a stable strategic order and the ethics of artificial intelligence. In the second half of 2015, the member states of the United Nations adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, also known as Agenda 2030, began as the Agenda 21, also the Paris Agreement on Climate was also adopted in 2015, the Paris Agreement, which is a treaty, which is an actual treaty. This is why Trump pulled us out of it. But in early 2016, the World Economic Forum and Chairman Klaus Schwab declared the transhuman and technocratic Fourth Industrial Revolution. So that's the official start, according to these cats anyway. 2016, Fourth Industrial Revolution has begun, they say. And so the stage was set then for the next move. See, we're building up to this Summit for the Future. So in 2016, Global Challenges Foundation and Laszlo that's a tough one. Zimbalvi, I like that. Laszlo Zimbalvi in 2016 launched the competition called a New Shape Prize to promote, quote, new decision-making structures that could galvanize effective international action to tackle global catastrophic risks. The winners would receive $5 million US, and the interest was huge. At the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos in January 2018, Johan Rockström, one of the founders of Global Challenges Foundation, stated that the New Shape Prize is the first ever attempt to invite the whole world to come up with the best possible innovation ideas, because, they're going to listen to all of them for sure, aren't they? Of how we can find a new world order, a global governance pathway that will enable us to transition into a desired future, desired by whom? Where we avoid potentially global catastrophic catastrophic risks, ranging from the risk of nuclear war, pandemics, inequality, all the way down to climate system collapse. In that same meeting, Johan Rockström declared, with references to the World Economic Forum's own Global Risks Report, that a coalition of leading technology companies, engineers, and entrepreneurs would come together to become stewards of the planet and lead the world towards a zero carbon future. Now, when they claim to care about the poor and the developing nations, their effort towards a zero carbon future, cutting more and more and more fossil fuels, just continues to cut the throats, to harm, to destroy these developing nations, because fossil fuels are the best form of energy we have. And as you just heard from Alex Epstein, there really is no climate catastrophe. There is no climate threat. In fact, over the last 100 years, deaths as a result of climate catastrophes have decreased 98%. It's a scam. All of it's a scam. As would be exposed in Bostrom's Extra-P website files, I'll just finish up quickly here. Jacob goes on to write that Nick Bostrom was exposed as a racist. In fact, really as a eugenicist. And so you find eugenics at the core of these. Eugenics is still alive and well. It's an important part of transhumanism. And it is a foundational element just below the surface of the United Nations advisors and policymaking. Of course, global socialism, or what is the realization of a communist utopia, is very much a discriminatory system. You discriminate against the haves, those who are considered to have privilege. And when you do that, you end up hurting everyone. Okay, let's see here. James Roguski, Exit the Who. That's where you need to go to let's see here. There we go. I think it's, let me just type it in to see. ExitTheWho.com. Yeah, if you just put in ExitTheWho.com, it'll take you right there. You could shoot that QR code if you want. I'll throw it up there for just a second if anybody's into doing that. And that'll take you right to the website too. This is something you can do right now. We are big on that. I don't know what the point is of coming on here and explaining all the details of how the world's falling apart if we don't ever tell you what you can do about it. This is just more of the United Nations website. Not much to see here, really. Summit of the Future, UN's website. More videos, future generations. And now that you know that we've tried to help you understand and raise your awareness of what the language of Marxism sounds like, let's just listen to another clip. Let's just pick one here. It's time for a new agenda for peace. That sounds like a good one. Now let's just listen. I haven't listened to this yet. Let's just see if we can pick up on what's their worldview, What's really their economic strategy? Is it capitalist? Is it free market? Is it socialism? Let's just listen.
We are living through uniquely uncertain times. Global power dynamics are becoming more complex. Nuclear weapons are an ever-present threat. Unregulated tech is fueling hatred and disinformation. The climate
Unregulated tech is fueling hatred. So we need a definition of what hatred is. It's always thrown out there as though it's just understood. Everybody knows what hatred is, but it's not. They don't mean what you mean when you say hatred. When they say hatred, they mean disagreement with our plan.
crisis is intensifying competition for resources. Ensuring peace is humanity.
They want to end competition. Who else wants to end competition? Competition is good. Competition is good for a market. It's good for markets. It's good for people. It's good. Competition is good for the world. So who wants to cut out competition and give everyone equal stuff, except for some people?
Humanity's greatest responsibility. But to address today's global challenges, we need to forge a new agenda for peace.
Peace. It's always about peace. It's always about raising up the proletariat and creating this utopia. When they say peace, they're implying utopia.
World leaders must come together through more representative, collective action to prevent
collective action, collectivism,
and resolve conflicts peacefully, promote the peaceful use of outer space, address new threats to security, and build a safer, more inclusive and sustainable world for our
a more inclusive and sustainable world for our common
future.
I mean, our common future. It's almost right there in the word, isn't it? Communism.
When the world unites, peace is possible.
Workers of the world unite. All right, it's all over the place. Let's ask a question here. Is it the government's duty to protect the people? Because if we're going to go out into our communities and we're going to engage with our city councilmen and our sheriffs, our police departments, we're going to become local leaders, we want to understand, is it the government's duty to protect the people? Your instinct might be to say, yeah, it's the government's duty to protect the people, right? That seems obvious. I'll suggest to you one more time, like we've said here for maybe a couple months now. We have all been infected with this mindset. We've all been infected by postmodernism. We've all been infected by expressive individualism. And all of those are elements that feed into the number one ideology that we've all been infected with, especially if you went to a public school anytime in the last 80 years. We've all been infected with Marxist ideology. I can tell you, I know I have, because I used to think the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Of course, that's just how the world works. No, that's not how the world works, especially in a free market economy. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer is a Marxist slogan. How in the world how did that ever get in my head? Public education, which has been this covert, did you ever notice that through your public education that you were taught probably a lot about fascism or about the National Socialist Party in Germany? Right? You're taught a lot about far right and Hitler. You probably weren't taught too much about far left. You probably weren't taught a whole lot about communism. You might have heard in civics class or social studies that, the Soviet Union is our big enemy. But you probably weren't taught much about why collectivism is ultimately destructive. And that's because our public education system has been a petri dish, a breeding ground for Marxist ideology, for collectivism. And now they've come through the institutions, they've come through academia, now they're into the government, now they have control of the media, and you can see what the result is. Utter confusion everywhere. So is it the government's duty to protect the people? The assertion that a democratic government's primary duty is to protect its citizens from harm misconstrues the fundamental role of government. What is that? If you think this way, this kind of a stance, if it's taken to its logical conclusion, leads to totalitarianism, right? It would entail an expansive and intrusive government. Government's essential duty should be to secure the rights of its citizens, maintain a just legal system, and protect its borders. Going beyond that ventures into territory typically associated with socialist ideologies, where the government assumes a paternalistic role in citizens' life. That means they want to be your daddy, because they are the ultimate authority. They want to be your father. If the government's duty is to protect its citizens from harm, this would require a definition of harm that extends beyond physical safety. You heard earlier, it's about protecting people from harm. It's about mental health. That extends beyond physical safety into areas like emotional distress, economic inequality, and social discomfort. Government intervention in these areas requires comprehensive control over markets, over speech, over social interactions, who you're allowed to talk to. It requires comprehensive control over areas that are traditionally seen as the domain of individual responsibility. That's traditionally liberal democracy. Francis Schaeffer argued that when government attempts to do too much for the individual, it inevitably infringes on personal freedoms, leading to this overreaching state apparatus, or what we would call totalitarianism, authoritarianism. To protect from all possible harms, the state would have to adopt this role as the father figure. The state would have to decide what is best for you in all areas of your life. Now, obviously, that diminishes individual agency, individual liberties. But more and more people are happy for the state to tell them what to do. John Stuart Mill, in his piece called On Liberty, warns of exactly this, where a benevolent government ends up constraining individual choice in the name of protection. And that erodes the autonomy that liberal democracies are meant to uphold. And as we've said many times already here today, your first focus doesn't need to be on national sovereignty. As a citizen, your first focus needs to be on local autonomy, ensuring it, maintaining it. And the way you do that, you have to be involved in it. Anybody who's telling you to stay out of it, I don't mean federal, I don't mean politics, the presidential race, I don't even mean your governor race, although that's important. But anybody who's telling you just to avoid politics altogether, to avoid local government at all costs, because for whatever reason, is not giving you sound advice. That will ultimately lead to you losing all of your freedoms. The notion of the government acting as a guardian figure undermines the principle of personal responsibility that is central to free societies. The only way free societies exist and maintain are when the people assert their rights and are willing to accept the consequences. A government that assumes the role of this protector from all forms of harm inevitably moves toward centralization of power and total government. Jacques Ellul, in his The Technological Society, describes how governments, in their pursuit of efficiency and protection, can become increasingly technocratic and authoritarian. Once the government defines harm so broadly, then it becomes easier and easier to justify all this extensive surveillance and censorship and economic regulation, all in the name of safety and well-being. Well-being economies. In this book, once again, For All Earth, remember? For all. Well-being economy and the well-being index. Ideas like the caring economy, the sharing economy, the circular economy. New ways, they say, of looking at what creates and sustains prosperity while also protecting the planet. The Well-Being Economy Alliance, called We All, that's silly, describes this framework as, quote, one that serves people and the planet. And Summer has told you many times that the idea that she picked up on years ago was the 3 Ps, the people, planet, and profits, would ultimately be, that would be the mantra for globalism in the future. And she was understanding this back in early 2000s, 2010s. And we've got the book, Econoculture. We'll have to bring that one back out of the... The Well-Being Economy Alliance does more than move money around, but delivers good lives to people. You see what they're telling you, right? This government is going to make your life good. They're going to create jobs. They're going to create freedom. You're going to have time to contemplate your navel all day. But how? How? They describe the core needs of human well-being. They've got it all figured out. Dignity. Dignity means you have enough to live in comfort, health, safety, and happiness. Is that really what dignity is? No, that's not what dignity is. Dignity is not happiness. Dignity is not safety or health or comfort. Dignity is an identity in the God who created you. The Imago Dei. You're created in the image of God. That's where your dignity comes from. Your sense of, well, it's your identity, right? They want to give you an identity. Another core need is nature, a restored and safe natural world for all life. Connection, a sense of belonging, and institutions that serve the common good. Fairness. Justice in all its dimensions is at the heart of economic systems, and the gap between the richest and poorest is greatly reduced. So fair, you can see that the term justice is replaced with the word fairness. It broadens it, right? And participation. Citizens are actively engaged in their communities and locally rooted economies. Well, I submit to you, if we were already participating in our local communities, our local governments, these things wouldn't have a chance. Setting well-being as the ultimate goal for economies means meeting human needs and capabilities while acknowledging the biophysical reality of a finite planet. So basically, they want to remove GDP as the measure, as a progress indicator, or as a measure of how well a nation is doing, and replace it with this pretty subjective idea of well-being, this well-being index. Which brings up the other idea of degrowth or post-growth or beyond growth, they call it. And again, folks, communism. Let me read the back cover. Capitalism is broken. Is capitalism broken? No. Capitalism's not broken. People are broken. The economic system is not the problem. The problem is the evil that runs through every human heart. The relentless pursuit of more has delivered climate catastrophe. Well, has it? Has it really? Social inequality and financial instability. It is a fact that when you have a free market, there will always be inequality. Because competition is good. And even in the United States, where the idea of post-growth is we have to take a place like the United States back. We have to degrow your economy and degrow your infrastructure, degrow your income, degrow your lifestyle. And when they get involved in your life at this level, it leads to gradual erosion of freedom. Citizens ultimately start trading liberty for a false sense of security. Ben Franklin or somebody like that said that anybody who gives up liberty for security will have neither. Doesn't deserve either, won't have either. Classical liberal theorists like John Locke and the framers of the U.S. Constitution argued that the primary role of government is to secure natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Protecting citizens from harm should be confined to preventing physical threats, administering justice, and safeguarding national security. Any other extension of government power into how people feel and what they think is infringing on their natural rights. The government is going beyond its duty. The role of government is to maintain a fair legal framework, prevent overt injustice, not to engineer society to prevent all forms of harm. What is the government's role? Within the context of liberal democracy, government should be limited to the protection of individual rights, maintaining just and corruption-free legal systems, and ensuring the sovereignty of the nation's borders. Again, it's up to us to protect our sovereignty at the local level by protecting the autonomy of our local governments. What do I mean by protecting the autonomy of your local government? That means being involved so you can prevent something like non-governmental organizations who do the bidding of the United Nations or the WHO from coming in and influencing your local government. It means you have to be aware that they're doing it. You have to know what to look for. And hopefully we're helping you out with that. But these duties that we describe from what a government is for are clearly defined. They will be clearly defined, and they will aim to create a stable environment where citizens can exercise their freedoms without undue interference. So where these people claim to be going to create this well-being economy and everyone's going to feel good and that's not their job, and they can't do that. They can promise it, but they can't deliver on it. They never could. That's communism. It doesn't work out. A government's job is to, as we've said, is to make sure that the playing field is working, the legal system. We don't have people invading us from all over the place. And then to get out of the way and let the market decide. The government also might get involved in some regulations. Right? You don't want companies hiring 12-year-olds to make their sneakers. That's a bad thing. But see, that's not a function of the economic system. That's an evil heart. That's a fallen human being making a bad choice. So socialism, the argument against all of Marx's theories is this. Marx said that capitalism is ultimately necessarily evil because capitalism can't provide for the needs of all of its citizens. And capitalism leads to alienation and oppression, inequality. Well, Marx borrowed from the Bible when he did that. He borrowed from the concept of original sin and applied it to an economic system. Therefore, everything that flows from Marxism from that point is going to be skewed, flawed, messed up. It's never going to work because two things are wrong. They have incorrectly identified the source of evil, and what was my second point? Well, they've incorrectly identified the source of evil, for sure, which means that as long as you've identified the economic system as the evil thing, you're going to bring this over into, now socialism's going to work because it's not evil. It's for the people. Problem is, the same people, the same fallen human beings are going to be in that socialist system, in that collectivist system. So liberal democracy and free market capitalism is the only combination of government and economy that provides the most actual well-being for the most people. It's, in a sense, I might even say it's the biblical. It would be the biblical, the way that the Lord has arranged the world, separating us off into nations at the Tower of Babel, enshrining private property in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not steal. Don't covet your neighbor's goods. The legal system protects citizens from harm by enforcing contracts, punishing fraud, addressing violence, but the legal system does not intervene in matters of emotional offense, hate speech. What's happening in the UK right now is, well, it's not liberal democracy. When if they say something about our democracy, they don't have one of those anymore. Because they're adjudicating emotional offenses. They're adjudicating any inequality of outcome. These are issues that can only be best addressed by individuals or civil society, meaning that perhaps institutions that the people create to debate and deal with issues like this, but it's not the legal system's duty to get involved with that. When governments begin to take on the task of protecting individuals from broader, less tangible forms of harm like economic disparity and social inequality or psychological distress, climate anxiety, then they're off into socialist and collectivist ideologies. That's what the United States is. There's no question about it. Socialist governance models often justify extensive welfare programs or well-being programs. There's another point in here where they want to saying goodbye to poverty. Anytime they claim they're going to end poverty, they're selling you a bill of goods. They can't promise such a thing. That's economic redistribution. That's centralized. It requires centralized planning under the guise of protecting citizens from harm. Again, fallen human beings, same fallen human beings are in that system. As philosopher Stephen Hicks points out, such policies often result in the erosion of personal freedoms as the state takes on an ever-growing role in shaping not only the economy, but the moral and social fabric of society. And that's the big point I want you to take away today from what we've been talking about here. The United Nations, in the Summit of the Future, they're making a moral argument. And they're appealing to some kind of transcendent authority that they haven't identified because they believe it rests in them. And ultimately, it is a religion. It might even be the new world religion, the one world religion. I don't know yet. Could be. Looks like in the Pope, we might have something that looks a lot like a false prophet or the false prophet. I don't see an Antichrist figure yet, because to be the Antichrist, almost everyone in the world would have to love that figure, and I don't see anybody like that. We're polarized. But in these systems, individual rights are subordinated to the collective. And that contradicts the foundational principles of liberal democracy, of freedom, of liberty, of democracy, the term they use so much. Christians are spiritual exiles. We're sojourners in a foreign land. But the truth is, right now, this foreign land is our home. And our God has charged us with the responsibility of being His faithful representatives in this age, right now, for a purpose. And that is to fulfill this solemn command. And that as we navigate through this tumultuous cultural revolution and the destabilization of our nation, and as we experience more and more persecution for being Christians, well, we can glean timeless and immediately applicable advice from the book of Daniel. Daniel's account of the exile of his nation in Babylon. So I would encourage you to specifically go to Daniel chapter 3. The central message of the book of Daniel is unmistakable. God is sovereign and rules over all people and kingdoms, even though it doesn't always look that way. Although the Babylonians and then the Persians after seemed to control the world at the time, Daniel proclaims that Yahweh is still very much in control and is moving to bring history itself to His divinely directed culmination. So, there's much more to history than is often apparent on the surface. So don't get down. Don't be discouraged because things seem like they're falling apart. The true and faithful followers of God can expect to suffer. Maybe not always, but some for sure. But it's how we respond to suffering that separates us, that makes us different in the world. And we can endure it. We can endure suffering because we know that God is in control. He will ultimately bring history to a climax centered on the establishment of His kingdom. Daniel 6, 26, 27. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and He saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. Now that's good news. And that news will sustain you in hard times. Daniel also exposes the arrogance of human rulers, wicked rulers who think that they can rule every aspect of your life, and that they attract judgment from God. But that God gives rule and dominion to humans. Daniel 4, 10 to 12 paints a picture of the good that can be achieved by human rulers. When humans image God, they have the right to rule in His name. But when they try to be God, then they forfeit that right. And they become like the beast. Those who recognize God's rule over them are in a position to allow God to rule through them. And that's our goal. God allows rulers enough freedom to become bestial And because of that, sometimes the faithful do suffer. And Daniel's stories encourage the faithful to become involved in a pagan world. To become involved in it with the hope of some measure of success and effective witness, even if there are risks, willing to accept the consequences. Even when it seems impossible, God's sovereignty means that the faithful cannot take his response to their situation for granted. Belshazzar's, in chapter 5, I think, Belshazzar's, the king, blasphemous conduct meets with swift retribution. Sometimes that judgment comes fast. The little horn is allowed a much longer time to reign before being ended. The faithful may be delivered from death in a fiery furnace, chapter 3, or through death in the fires of persecution. So Daniel lived through one of the most momentous periods of ancient Israel's history. And to see his relevance for believers today, there are some parallels to the Babylonian captivity that we see today. They found themselves in a hostile culture whose values and worldviews and language was very different. They went from being the predominant culture to the counterculture. That's what's happened to Christianity in the West. We've gone from being the predominant culture, now we're the counterculture. Now, being Christian is punk rock all of a sudden. They went from being cultural leaders to cultural captives. Also, the church has moved from the mainstream to the sidelines. The church has moved from being a world leader to a world follower. The church has moved from being a light on a hill to a little light hidden under a bowl. So the Western church today, Christians today, we're in our own Babylonian captivity. We're living in exile. We're now strangers in a strange land. So how do we respond to it all? Daniel got involved. So did his three friends. There are at least 7 main responses from the story of Daniel that we should bear in mind as we ponder this situation. I'll just give you a couple of them. Be aware of the problem, first of all. Too many believers today have no clue that we're even living in exile. They have no clue of what the United Nations is doing right now, or what's taking place all around us. They're apathetic and ignorant about the all-out war on faith, freedom, and family. Lamentations 1:1-3. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. Let's go to the next one. We're not to compromise while we live in exile. Daniel and his friends were challenged right from the start, early on. And they determined to not compromise, as you see in Daniel 1:8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, with their delicacies. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. So he went to the principle of subsidiarity. He went to the closest authority figure, official. The biblical principle of authority is you go to the closest one, not all the way to the central planner 10,000 miles away, or let's just say 3,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., or 6,000 miles away in Geneva, Switzerland. We're not to respond with negotiated settlements. We don't compromise. We're not to make deals with our captors so that we can get along easier. The famous story about the statue set up by Nebuchadnezzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. They said, "O king Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer concerning this matter as to why we're not falling down and worshiping when you tell us to. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he doesn't, let it be known to you, Mr. President, let it be known to you, Mr. Gutierrez, Mr. Tedros, Mr. Schwab, whoever. Let it be known to you. We're not going to serve your gods. We're not going to worship your golden image that you've set up. Even if our God doesn't rescue us from your persecution, even if he doesn't deliver us, even if you want to punish us and persecute us and kill us dead, we're not going to serve your gods. We're not going to worship the golden image that you've set up. And I think that's a good place to leave it for today. God bless you, my friends, and we hope to see you here again very soon. Please download the Armor of Truth mobile app so you can get all of our updates. You can find out what we're up to, because you might not see us on YouTube very much, or because they're trying to keep us down. But we're not going to worship their gods. We're not going to worship their golden image. We're not going to negotiate settlements with them. I haven't even responded to the last smackdown they gave us because they're wrong. And I know they're wrong. And they're not going to back off on it. But God has been good to us, has provided for us, and has provided people around us that have made it possible for us to do this. We've been richly blessed in this work, and Summer and myself personally, and we want to offer, we just want to say thank you for your support. And if you can support us in any way, there'll be some links in the description here that you can follow, or on the Armor of Truth mobile app. So until next time, my friends, God bless you. We'll see you later.
Well, that's a rather interesting position coming from a man on a crusade against the evils of technology.
I'm not against technology, Doctor. I'm against the men who deify it at the expense of human truth.
Armor of Truth, live.
In the age of technocracy, scientism, and pop atheism,
faith is resistance.
Nietzsche, of course, announced the death of God and called for the birth of the Übermensch, the Superman, who would take humanity to new heights and to create a new world order.
Find us at the Armor of Truth YouTube channel and log on armoroftruth.net.
Then a redistribution of wealth and government control via global governance. This fits right into the communist and socialist ideology that defines today's Democrat Party in this country. Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and their administration would like nothing more than to pass their responsibility to protect this country's health and livelihood to another country, many of which do not appreciate the United States, do not like the United States, and many of which are hostile to the United States. They would love nothing more than to pass this responsibility to these countries. I am a firm believer that from this point forward, we should never give another penny to the World Health Organization. They have not represented us well. They never have, and they never will. They are not an ally to this country. They are not an asset to this country. We should not be paying hard-earned taxpayer dollars for their efforts that are oftentimes against us. With regards to the United Nations, I've said it before, I'll say it again, I think the best thing we could do for the United Nations is to go to New York and push the entire thing off into the East River. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tony.